Tonight we enter Jericho, not as tourists crossing a modern road, not as pilgrims chasing an echo from Scripture, but as wanderers moving backward through dust, stone, and silence toward a time before kings sat on thrones, before scribes pressed signs into clay, before bronze flashed in the sun, before the first great river kingdoms learned to call themselves eternal. Tonight we stand at the edge of a mound in the lower Jordan Valley, where the earth rises not like a mountain, but like a memory, layer upon layer, generation upon generation, house floor upon house floor. The mound of ancient Jericho holds within it the compressed breath of human ambition. Here, beneath the sun-struck soil, archaeologists uncovered evidence of something so old that it still troubles the imagination. A settled community, stone-built, organized, enduring, and surrounded by walls, was already taking shape around 9,000 years before the birth of Christ. And this is the enigma: who built the first city on earth? Not the first empire, not the first kingdom, not even the first place where people gathered for a season and moved on when the herds departed or the rains failed. Jericho was something different. It was a place where human beings began to stay. They returned to the same spring. They buried their dead beneath their floors. They stacked stones in deliberate courses. They raised a tower that has outlived every name ever spoken beside it. They gathered food, shaped tools, watched the horizon, and perhaps for the first time in the long human story, began to understand that a community could become a permanent fact upon the landscape. The scientific evidence is the anchor in this darkness. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from the site has placed the earliest major settlement phases deep within the pre-pottery Neolithic, a period when pottery itself had not yet become common in this region. Stratigraphic excavation, the patient reading of earth layers one above another, revealed that Jericho was not a single moment, not one mysterious flash of genius, but an accumulation of lives. Lithic analysis of stone blades, sickle elements, scrapers, and projectile points allows us to glimpse the hands of the people who cut reeds, harvested cereals, worked hides, and hunted across the dry hills. Later genomic data from the wider Levant has begun to show how deeply rooted and yet how connected these early communities were, woven into movements of ancestry, exchange, and adaptation that stretched across Western Asia. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. For we do not know what these people called themselves. We do not know the songs they sang at night when the desert cooled and the stars sharpened above the valley. We do not know the names of their children, their elders, their healers, their dead. No tablet records their laws. No royal inscription boasts of victory. No carved monument announces the founder of Jericho. The builders left no written explanation for the walls, no plan for the tower, no sacred text to tell us whether their labor was practical, fearful, ceremonial, or all these things at once. Yet the stones remain. Imagine the valley in the early morning. The air is cool, faintly damp near the spring, carrying the scent of water and mud into a land that otherwise leans toward dryness. Beyond the settlement, pale ridges rise under a washed blue sky. Gazelles move in the distance, birds lift from reed beds. Families stir inside round houses of mud brick and plaster, houses pressed close together, their floors swept by hands that knew every corner. Smoke threads upward from hearths. Someone sharpens a stone blade. Someone grinds grain with the slow rhythm of endurance. Someone carries a basket. Another tends a child. Another looks toward the wall and the world beyond it. This was not yet urban life as later civilizations would understand it. There were no palaces of baked brick, no public squares lined with merchants, no professional armies marching beneath banners. But to dismiss Jericho as merely a village would be to miss the shock of its existence. At a time when much of humanity still moved through landscapes in small bands, reading animal tracks, wild plants, weather, and season, the people of Jericho gathered in numbers large enough to require cooperation on a new scale. They invested labor into construction that no single household could have made alone. They created a place where memory accumulated, where the dead remained close, where the community itself became a structure. Here the conventional story begins to tremble. For generations, many imagined that agriculture came first, then villages, then towns, then religion, then cities, then civilization. But sites across the ancient Near East have complicated that comfortable ladder. Jericho belongs to a world where ritual, gathering, cultivation, climate stress, and social experiment may all have risen together in a tangled web. Perhaps people did not simply farm and then become spiritual. Perhaps shared beliefs, sacred obligations, ancestor memories, and communal ceremonies helped bind them strongly enough to plant, store, build, and remain. Perhaps the city was not born from grain alone, but from longing, fear, reverence, and the deep human need to belong somewhere in the face of an immense and indifferent world. Gods and mortals once walked the earth, or so later peoples would say. At Jericho, we are close to the roots of that feeling, not because we can prove that these early people worshipped gods, as later temples would know them, but because their world was almost certainly alive with unseen meanings. The spring was not just water. The dead were not just bones. The wall was not just stone. The tower was not just height. The horizon, the storm, the harvest, the animal, the ancestor beneath the floor, all may have belonged to a web of power and presence that shaped how people moved, worked, slept, and remembered. And so the first city on earth is not a simple answer waiting in the dust. It is a question carved into a mound. Was Jericho built by farmers seeking safety? By hunter-gatherers becoming something new? By ritual communities bound to a sacred spring? By families protecting stored food? By elders directing labor? By equals working together through necessity? The honest answer is that the evidence speaks in fragments. Walls, floors, burials, tools, seeds, plaster, stone, and ash. From these fragments, archaeology builds its careful lantern against the dark, answerless, adrift to ponder. We begin where all ancient history must begin, not with certainty, but with humility. The people of Jericho were not primitive shadows waiting for civilization to arrive. They were thoughtful, adaptive, observant human beings facing climate, hunger, death, memory, and hope with minds as vivid as our own. They chose, for reasons still partly concealed, to make a home so enduring that its buried remains would challenge every later age that tried to define where civilization began. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as the night settles around you, post your location and your local time. so we may know where in the modern world this ancient story has found you. Before there were walls, before the tower rose like a stone question against the sky, before the dead were laid beneath the floors of houses, there was water in the lower Jordan Valley, where the land sinks toward one of the strangest depressions on earth. Water was never merely a convenience. It was command. It was invitation. It was destiny flowing out of the ground. Ancient Jericho gathered around a spring whose presence transformed the surrounding world, turning dryness into possibility and danger into shelter. In a landscape where the sun could harden the earth and the winds could comb dust across the plain, a steady source of water meant more than survival. It meant return. It meant memory. It meant that people could begin to measure life not only by movement, but by place. The spring near ancient Jericho, known today as one of the great natural features of the oasis, poured life into a region otherwise marked by severe contrasts. To the west rose the hills, shadowed and pale in the changing light. To the east lay the valley floor, where heat could shimmer in the distance like a veil. The air carried the scent of mineral earth, wild grasses, damp reeds, and animal trails. Here, where water touched soil, plants gathered in thicker abundance. Birds came, herds came, people came. In the earliest human world, this would have been obvious long before anyone built permanent houses. Hunters tracking gazelle or wild cattle would have understood the rhythm of the spring. Gatherers searching for edible plants, nuts, seeds, and roots would have known that wet ground held different promises from the dry slopes beyond. Seasonal camps may have formed near such places again and again, perhaps first for days, then weeks, then longer stretches, until the site became familiar enough to feel claimed by memory. A spring does not simply water a settlement. It organizes time. The people who gathered at ancient Jericho could rely on a continuity rare in harsh environments. They did not have to chase every passing opportunity. The dependable presence of water allowed edible plants to be watched, harvested, perhaps encouraged, and eventually cultivated with increasing intention. Wild cereals in the broader region, once gathered by hand or with stone sickles, could be processed near the settlement. Seeds could be stored. Grinding stones could remain in one place instead of being carried across long distances. Tools could accumulate. Houses could be repaired rather than abandoned. Children could learn every contour of the ground around them, not as a temporary camp, but as the landscape of childhood. This is where the transformation becomes profound. A mobile band carries its world upon the body. A settled community begins to place its world into the earth. At Jericho, the spring made that act imaginable. Mud could be shaped into bricks. Reeds could be gathered for roofing or matting. Plaster could be prepared and spread across floors. Stones could be selected, hauled, arranged, and left for those who would wake there tomorrow, and the day after, and the season after that. The ground itself began to receive human intention, but the oasis also brought risk. Where resources concentrate, so does competition. Animals drawn to water might have attracted hunters, but they may also have attracted predators. Human groups approaching the same spring could have become allies, rivals, marriage partners, trading companions, or enemies. Stored food, if storage was already becoming important, would have required protection from insects, dampness, rodents, and perhaps other people. The very abundance of Jericho may have created the need for coordination, rules, and shared vigilance. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of the first settled places. Permanence gives comfort, but it also creates vulnerability. A group that moves can avoid certain conflicts. A group that stays must defend relationships, supplies, boundaries, and obligations. The spring gave Jericho life, yet it may also have forced its people into new kinds of social discipline. Who had the right to draw water? Who maintained access to the spring? Who decided when fields or gathering zones were ready? Who settled disputes between households? Archaeology cannot overhear their arguments, yet the settlement itself whispers that cooperation had become essential. Imagine a morning at the oasis when the settlement is already awake. Bare feet press into packed earth. A child crouches near the damp margin where insects tremble above the water. An elder watches the sky, reading heat before it fully arrives. Women and men move with baskets, stone tools, skins, and bundles of plant stems. The spring glints in the angled light. Its sound, small but constant, threads through everything. To modern ears, it might seem gentle. To ancient ears, it may have sounded like permission to remain alive. The environment around Jericho was not empty wilderness waiting for human mastery. It was a living field of choices and pressures. The Jordan Valley offered varied ecological zones within reach: wetland margins, open steppe, hill slopes, and seasonal plant communities created a mosaic of resources. Such diversity mattered. It allowed people to combine hunting, gathering, cultivation, and storage before any single strategy had fully conquered the others. Jericho's inhabitants may not have thought of themselves as farmers in the later sense. They may have been something more complex and transitional: skilled foragers who cultivated, hunters who stored grain, gatherers who built walls, ritual people who also understood the practical mathematics of food. The oasis made this mixture possible. Water also changes the imagination. A dry place teaches movement and scarcity. A spring teaches recurrence. It offers the same miracle each day. And from that repetition, human beings may begin to think differently about the future. The people of Jericho could plan around return. They could expect that the spring would still be there when children became adults and adults became ancestors. That expectation, fragile though it always was, may have helped create the emotional foundation of settlement. To build is to believe, at least for a moment, that tomorrow will resemble today enough to justify the labor. And so, beneath every later mystery of Jericho, beneath every debate about fortification, ritual, ancestry, and authority, there remains this simpler truth: the first great architect of the city was not a king, it was not a warrior, it was not a priest whose name has vanished. It was water rising from hidden places in the earth. Yet water alone does not build a city. The spring invited, but human hands answered. The oasis offered possibility, but people turned possibility into walls, floors, hearths, burials, and memory. Between the gift of nature and the ambition of the community, Jericho began to emerge as something that should almost not have existed so early, and yet did. In the desert brightness, beside the patient spring, humanity learned that home could be more than a campfire under stars. Home could be a place to which the living returned, the dead remained, and the future slowly took shape in mud, stone, breath, and belief. The first people to dig into Jericho did not merely open the ground. They opened an argument with time. For centuries, the mound stood beneath the sky with the deceptive quiet of an ordinary hill. Shepherds passed it. Travelers saw it. Pilgrims imagined it through the language of later traditions. The soil was wind-worn, sun-baked, and layered with fragments too small for casual eyes to understand. A shard here, a stone there, a rise in the landscape that looked natural until the spade began to cut and the earth revealed that it was not a hill at all, but a vast archive of human occupation. Such mounds are made by living. Houses collapse. New houses rise above the old. Hearths are swept clean and then buried. Floors crack. Walls erode. Burials are placed beneath rooms. Dust enters everything. A settlement does not vanish in one dramatic instant. More often, it thickens. Its remains pile upward slowly until human life has made a small mountain of itself. In the 19th century, when explorers first turned their attention toward Jericho, archaeology was still learning how to become a science. The world of excavation was often driven by great stories, sacred geography, imperial curiosity, and the hunger for visible treasures. Men arrived with notebooks, measuring rods, hired laborers, and expectations formed before the earth had spoken. They wanted walls that could be matched to famous tales. They wanted destruction layers that seemed to answer ancient texts. They wanted the mound to confess quickly. But Jericho refused to be simple. Early excavations cut into the site with enthusiasm, yet not always with the careful methods later generations would demand. Trenches were opened, stones exposed, pottery collected, and interpretations announced. Some believed they had found evidence of dramatic destruction. Others struggled to understand how many cities lay stacked within the mound. The difficulty was immense. Jericho was not one city, but many settlements, many eras, many human worlds pressed together in a single body of earth. The deeper the digging went, the stranger the story became. By the early 20th century, archaeology had become more disciplined, though still shaped by the assumptions of its age. Excavators began to recognize that the mound contained sequences of occupation stretching far beyond the periods most familiar to historians: pottery, architecture, soil color, ash, stonework, and burial practice all had to be read like chapters in a damaged manuscript. The ground demanded patience. A careless cut could destroy the very relationship between objects that gave them meaning. Then came one of the most important figures in the history of Jericho's excavation, Kathleen Kenyon. In the 1950s, Kenyon brought to the site a level of stratigraphic discipline that transformed its interpretation. Her method did not treat the mound as a treasure chest. It treated it as a layered structure of evidence. She used careful excavation techniques designed to preserve vertical profiles of the mound, allowing the sequence of deposits to be studied with far greater clarity. The sides of her trenches became walls of time, where changes in occupation could be traced through soil, debris, collapsed buildings, and construction phases. This mattered profoundly. At a site as complex as Jericho, the age of an object is not understood by the object alone. A stone tool, a piece of charcoal, a human bone, or a fragment of plaster gains its deeper meaning from where it lies. What lies above it, what lies below it, and what surrounds it. Stratigraphic excavation became the grammar through which Jericho could finally begin to speak with precision. The mound was no longer only a place of famous associations. It became a scientific record. Kenyon's work revealed that beneath the later cities of the Bronze Age lay something far older and more astonishing. Deep in the mound were remains belonging to the pre-pottery Neolithic, a world before ceramics had become part of daily life in the region. There were roundhouses, there were floors, there were burials, there were stone tools and signs of settled community, and there, most astonishingly, were massive works of stone that seemed to belong to an age far more socially complex than scholars had once imagined. The discovery did not answer every question. It made the questions larger. How could people so early organize the labor needed for major construction? What kind of community could maintain itself at such a scale before writing, before metal tools, before the later machinery of kingship and taxation? Was this a fortified settlement, a ritual center, an oasis village swollen by abundance, or some category for which modern language remains too narrow? The spade had reached a world older than expectation. Picture the excavation itself under the heat of the valley. The morning begins pale and cool, but the light strengthens quickly. Workers move through dust with baskets, trowels, picks, and brushes. The sound is not loud, but constant, scraping, calling, footsteps on dry soil, the slight clink of stone against stone. A trench wall rises, showing bands of human presence like the rings of an ancient tree. Each layer is a vanished surface where someone once walked, worked, cooked, prayed, slept, grieved, or feared. The archaeologist's task is almost an act of controlled destruction. To uncover one layer often means removing another. Every decision carries consequence. The earth cannot be uncut. The old floor cannot be exposed twice in the same untouched way. This is why records, drawings, measurements, photographs, and careful descriptions become sacred tools of the discipline. Archaeology is not only discovery, it is responsibility before the dead. At Jericho, that responsibility was immense because the site stood at the crossroads of science, memory, and belief. Many came to Jericho expecting confirmation of later stories. What emerged instead was far more powerful. The mound revealed a human past deeper than legend, stranger than simple certainty, and older than the written imagination. The first great revelation of Jericho was not that it belonged to a single famous moment, but that it contained a sequence of human daring reaching back into a prehistoric dawn. Radiocarbon dating strengthened the shock. Organic samples, once tested, helped place the earliest settlement phases in a time that seemed to overturn familiar assumptions about the rise of civilization. Lithic analysis gave texture to daily life, identifying the technical skill of stoneworkers who shaped blades and tools with immense control. Botanical remains suggested the processing and use of plant foods in a community increasingly tied to place. Human remains, including extraordinary mortuary practices, revealed that social memory was built not only into walls, but into bodies. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The excavators could measure stones, but not hear the chants once spoken near them. They could map houses, but not recover the full warmth of a family gathering beside a hearth. They could identify a burial beneath a floor, but not know the private grief that placed it there. Science gave Jericho age, structure, and context, yet mystery remained at the center, not as a failure of scholarship, but as the natural silence of a world before writing. The great digging into Jericho taught a humbling lesson. The past does not wait underground as a complete story. It waits as fragments, and each generation of scholars must decide how carefully it will listen. The mound yielded not a single clear answer, but an invitation into deeper wonder. Beneath the dust lay a settlement older than cities, as they were once imagined. Older than kings, older than the confident categories of civilization, and in that revelation, Jericho became not merely an archaeological site, but a threshold. To cut into its earth was to pass beyond history's written gates and enter a realm where humanity first began to gather itself into permanence, leaving behind no names, only layers, stones, tools, bones, and the enduring question of what made people stay. In the depths of ancient Jericho, beneath the dust of later ages, and below the familiar levels of cities that belong to pottery, bronze, and written memory, archaeologists found a structure that still feels almost impossible. A tower of stone. It was not a palace tower. It was not attached to a castle. It was not raised by kings whose names were carved into inscriptions. It belonged to a world before writing, before metal tools, before the great bureaucracies that would later command labor with seals, taxes, and scribes. Yet there it stood, massive, deliberate, carefully built, rising from the earliest known settlement layers like a monument from a dream that humanity had not yet learned to explain. The Tower of Pre-Pottery Neolithic Jericho is one of the most astonishing architectural discoveries in the ancient world. Its stones were set by people who possessed no wheel, no draft animals, no iron chisels, no royal engineers drawing plans on parchment. Their tools were simple by later standards, yet their achievement was not simple at all. Stone had to be found, moved, shaped, fitted, and raised. Labor had to be organized. Time had to be devoted to a project that exceeded the needs of a single family. The tower was not an accident of habitation. It was intention made vertical. In a settlement of rounded houses and close domestic life, the tower announced another scale of thought. It demanded that people imagine not only shelter but monumentality. It required a community to work together toward a structure whose meaning may have been larger than food, larger than sleep, larger than the immediate needs of survival. In this sense, the tower is not silent. It speaks in the language of effort. Yet what it says remains uncertain. Some have imagined it as a defensive structure, part of a wider system of protection. A tower beside a wall suggests watchfulness. From height, one might scan the surrounding land, observe approaching animals, distant people, movement near the oasis, or threats forming along the horizon. In a place of concentrated resources, such watchfulness would have mattered. Stored grain, access to water, and settled households created new vulnerabilities. The tower may have been part of a practical response to the dangers of staying in one place. But defense alone does not exhaust the mystery. The tower's position, form, and scale have encouraged other interpretations. Perhaps it was a communal marker, a symbol of belonging visible within the settlement. Perhaps it was a structure of ritual importance, a place where movement upward carried meaning. Perhaps its staircase, enclosed within the mass of stone, created a passage not merely through architecture, but through experience. To climb inside such a structure in the dimness, with stone pressing close on either side, would not have felt like crossing an ordinary space. It would have felt like entering the body of the mound itself. Imagine that climb! The air cools slightly, as one steps into shadow. The stone smells of dust, mineral damp, and human touch. Footsteps sound close, almost swallowed by the narrow passage. The world outside, bright with sun and wind, contracts into a tunnel of labor and weight. Each step rises because countless hands place the stones. Each movement upward carries the body away from the ordinary ground of hearths, floors, and daily tasks. At the top, the eyes might meet the valley, the spring, the settlement roofs, the distant hills, and the pale emptiness beyond. Was that view practical, sacred, or both? Ancient architecture often refuses modern categories. A later temple could store grain. A defensive wall could carry symbols. A house could be a shrine to ancestors. A tower could watch the horizon and also speak to the heavens. To ask whether the Jericho Tower was useful or meaningful may be to divide what its builders never divided. In their world, the practical and the sacred may have flowed together like water through soil. The tower may also have served as a tool of social formation. To build it, people had to cooperate beyond the household. They had to agree, or be persuaded, or be compelled. They had to gather at the same task, repeat actions, share knowledge, and accept a common purpose. The building process itself may have helped create the community that the finished tower represented. In other words, the tower was not only built by society, it may have helped build society. This idea is crucial. Human beings become bound together not only by blood, hunger, and fear, but by shared labor. A wall, a tower, a burial ceremony, a seasonal gathering, a feast, a harvest, all can draw people into patterns of obligation. The people of early Jericho may have learned through construction what it meant to act as a larger body. Stones carried together become memories carried together. A tower rising day by day becomes proof that many hands can produce something no individual could accomplish alone. Here, the first city begins to look less like a place and more like a transformation in consciousness. The tower's builders were not merely solving a problem. They were expressing a capacity. They could plan beyond the moment. They could coordinate effort. They could alter the landscape permanently. They could make something that outlasted its makers. This is one of the deepest thresholds in human history, the moment when people begin to create structures that become ancestors in their own right, standing after the builders have vanished, shaping the minds of children who never saw the first stone laid. A child born in the shadow of the tower would have inherited it as fact. To that child, the tower may have seemed as permanent as the spring or the hills. Its origin would already have belonged to older voices. Perhaps elders spoke of those who built it. Perhaps stories gathered around it. Perhaps its stones were touched during rites of passage. Perhaps its presence helped define who belonged inside the settlement and who came from beyond. Still, the most haunting possibility is that the tower may have been connected to fear of the sky. Some scholars have suggested that its placement and relationship to the surrounding landscape may have involved observation of celestial events or the looming shapes of nearby hills at sunset. Whether or not such interpretations can ever be proven, they remind us that ancient people watched the heavens with an intensity modern life has almost forgotten. Without artificial light, the night sky was not background. It was a vast, moving order. Stars returned. The moon changed. The sun traveled, burned, vanished, and rose again. The heavens could be calendar, omen, story, and presence. At Jericho, where settlement required attention to seasons, plants, water, and community rhythms, the sky would have mattered deeply. The tower, rising from the earth, may have joined ground and horizon in a single architectural gesture. It may have helped people measure time. It may have staged moments of gathering. It may have been a stone answer to anxieties no text will ever record. Answerless, adrift to ponder, we stand before this tower as before an ancient mind, not a mind belonging to one person, but to a community. Its thoughts were made of limestone, muscle, dust, and repetition. It knew the pressure of bodies moving stone beneath heat. It knew the dark interior of a stairway. It knew the sweep of the valley from height. It knew how permanence could be carved out of hardship. It knew that a settlement must become more than a cluster of shelters if it is to endure in memory. The tower beneath the mound is therefore more than an archaeological feature. It is one of humanity's earliest declarations that place could be shaped into meaning. It tells us that the builders of Jericho were not waiting for civilization to begin somewhere else. They were already experimenting with its deepest materials: shared labor, symbolic space, collective identity, fear, hope, and stone. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made, and whether some new method of analysis will draw a sharper meaning from the ancient masonry. For now, the tower remains what it has always been, a presence rising from the buried dawn, refusing to explain itself fully, yet refusing also to be ignored. It stands as a question built in stone. There was no single morning when the hunters of Jericho awoke and found themselves transformed into townspeople. No trumpet sounded across the valley. No elder announced that wandering had ended and history had begun. The change came more quietly, through repeated choices, through baskets filled and stored, through hearths repaired instead of abandoned, through children born into houses whose walls remembered the hands of their parents. Human life before settlement was not simple. The people who moved through the ancient Levant were expert readers of the world. They understood animal movement, plant seasons, stone quality, weather signs, water sources, and the subtle language of tracks in dust. A hunter kneeling beside a broken stem or a hoof print was not guessing blindly. He was interpreting evidence with the discipline of survival. A gatherer choosing seeds, roots, nuts, and fruits was not merely taking what nature offered. She was drawing on generations of knowledge, knowing which plants nourished, which healed, which poisoned, which returned after fire, and which waited for the right season. The first townspeople did not abandon this intelligence. They carried it into settled life. At Jericho, the movement from mobility toward permanence likely unfolded across generations. Families who once camped near the spring for seasonal abundance may have returned more often. Some stayed longer. Some began to protect certain resources. Some learned that wild cereals could be harvested in quantity and processed near home. Some discovered that storing grain brought both security and new responsibility. A basket of food saved for later is a promise against hunger, but it is also a burden. It must be guarded. It must be kept dry. It must be shared, defended, counted, remembered. Storage changes the human mind. A hunter moving across open land lives with immediate skill and flexible response. A household with stored food begins to live with calculation. How much remains? How many mouths must be fed? When will plants ripen again? What portion can be eaten now? What portion saved? What portion perhaps planted? What portion used in gatherings that bind people together? Such questions do not create civilization by themselves, but they prepare the ground beneath it. They teach future thinking. They make time visible inside containers. The houses of early Jericho were part of this transformation, round or oval structures built of mud brick and plaster, created a physical grammar of settled existence. A wall separated inside from outside. A floor could be cleaned, repaired, and used again. A hearth gathered warmth, food, smoke, and talk. A roof held back sun and rain. The house became a vessel for memory, not merely a shelter against weather. Objects could remain in place. Grinding stones could become familiar companions of daily labor. Tools could be stored where hands expected to find them. The domestic world thickened with repetition. Think of the sound of grain being ground in the morning, stone against stone, steady, patient, almost musical in its endurance. The work is physical, tiring, and intimate. It turns hard seeds into meal. It transforms the gathered landscape into food that children can eat. Around that sound, a different rhythm of life gathers. People no longer only pursue food across the horizon. They process it at home. They invest hours into activities that assume the settlement will continue. This is one of the great revolutions of the human story, and yet it was not always glorious. To settle is to gain and to lose. A fixed home offers safety, storage, and belonging, but it also binds people to work that cannot easily be escaped. Fields or gathering territories must be watched. Houses need repair. Waste accumulates. Disease may spread more easily where people live close together. Disputes among neighbors cannot be solved simply by walking away forever. The first townspeople entered a bargain with permanence, and like all bargains, it carried hidden costs. Jericho shows us a society crossing that threshold. Lithic analysis helps reveal this world of practical intelligence. Stone blades and sickle elements suggest the cutting of plant stems. Scrapers speak of hide working. Projectile points point back toward hunting. Grinding stones and plant remains suggest the processing of cereals and other foods. These traces do not describe a people who instantly replaced one way of life with another. Instead, they reveal a mixed economy, flexible and adaptive, where hunting, gathering, cultivation, and storage may have coexisted in complex balance. This matters because the story of human settlement is often told too neatly. We imagine wandering bands becoming farmers, farmers becoming villagers, villagers becoming city dwellers, as if humanity marched up a staircase of progress. Jericho warns us against such simplicity. The people here were not stepping out of ignorance into advancement. They were experimenting. They were testing new relationships with land, labor, food, ancestors, and one another. Some choices must have succeeded. Others may have caused suffering. Still, the experiment continued long enough to leave deep archaeological traces. A settled community also creates new forms of childhood. In a mobile world, children learn movement as a basic fact of life. They learn the shape of many camps, the changing paths of animals, the seasonal unfolding of distant places. In a town, children learn walls, courtyards, neighbors, repeated paths to water, the familiar smell of plaster after heat, the exact places where adults store tools and food. They grow up with a stronger sense that identity belongs to a particular spot of earth. The land becomes personal, not only known, but inhabited. The dead deepen that attachment. When ancestors are buried near or beneath houses, the settlement becomes more than useful ground. It becomes sacred ground. The living are tied to the dead by physical proximity. A house is no longer merely the place where one family sleeps. It may become a chamber of lineage, memory, and obligation. Such practices would have strengthened the emotional force of staying. To leave a camp is one thing. To leave the bones of those who made you is another. The people of Jericho may have lived within a world where ancestors watched, blessed, warned, or demanded remembrance. Whether we call this religion, ritual, memory, or social practice, it likely helped bind households to place. The first towns may have required more than food security. They may have required stories strong enough to keep people together when the old freedom of movement called from beyond the settlement edge. Thus, the hunter becoming a townsperson was not simply changing diet. He or she was entering a new moral landscape. Cooperation became more constant. Personal actions affected more neighbors. Labor became shared across tasks larger than one family. The spring, the walls, the houses, the stored food, the buried dead, all formed a web of belonging and restraint. Imagine an elder who once traveled widely in youth, now sitting in the shade of a plastered wall, watching grandchildren who know the settlement as the center of the world. Perhaps that elder remembered distant valleys, hunting grounds, and camps under open stars. Perhaps the young listened with wonder, not fully able to imagine life without the house, the spring, the paths, the familiar smoke rising in morning air. In that quiet distance between memory and childhood, a new humanity was being born. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot know whether the people felt pride, unease, relief, or sorrow as their lives became more settled. We cannot know who resisted, who embraced the change, who left, who returned, who argued that the old ways were better. But the archaeological record shows that something extraordinary took hold. People stayed, they built, they stored, they buried, they repaired. They learned to make community endure. And so Jericho stands at a turning point, not because it was already a city in the later imperial sense, but because it reveals the first deep grammar of urban life, the grammar of permanence, the grammar of shared labor, the grammar of memory held in place. Here, hunters did not vanish, gatherers did not disappear. Instead, their knowledge was folded into a new experiment, one that would eventually reshape the entire human world. The first townspeople were not less wild than their ancestors. They were wild intelligence made stationary, the ancient human mind learning to root itself beside water, beneath sky, among neighbors, under the gaze of the dead. The famous walls of Jericho stand in the human imagination like the edge of the known world. They seem to divide safety from danger, home from wilderness, the gathered from the unknown. Yet when we descend into the earliest layers of the site, the meaning of those walls becomes far less certain and far more intriguing. A wall appears simple only from a distance, stone upon stone, line upon line, barrier against the outside. But archaeology teaches caution. The same structure can hold many meanings at once. It can stop floodwater. It can mark sacred ground. It can protect stored food. It can define belonging. It can organize labor. It can announce power. It can calm fear even when no enemy is near. At Jericho, the wall may have been all of these things, Or something stranger still, a boundary between ways of being. To build a wall in the pre-pottery Neolithic world was an enormous undertaking. Every stone had weight. Every section required planning. Earth had to be moved. Faces had to be aligned. Gaps had to be filled. People had to decide where the settlement ended and the outside began. That decision alone was revolutionary. For mobile hunters and gatherers, territory was known through paths, water, memory, and season. For settled people, territory could become a line in stone. A line in stone changes everything. Inside that line, daily life becomes gathered and intensified. Houses stand close to one another. Smoke rises from familiar hearths. Children move through spaces known by repeated touch. Tools, baskets, food stores, sleeping places, and burial grounds all exist within a defined enclosure. Outside the line lies the wider world, still necessary, still rich with plants, animals, stone sources, and seasonal movement, yet now subtly separated from the heart of community. The wall does not only keep things out, it tells the people within that they are together. Many have naturally imagined such walls as defenses. After all, later cities built walls against armies, raiders, and siege engines. Yet Jericho's earliest wall belongs to a period long before professional soldiers, chariots, and royal warfare. That does not mean violence was absent. Human conflict is far older than cities. Rival groups may have competed over water, food, hunting grounds, or stored resources. A settled oasis community would have possessed things worth taking: grain, tools, access to the spring, prepared shelters, and accumulated goods could attract danger. A wall might have given warning, delay, and psychological protection. But the case is not closed. Some scholars have argued that the wall may have helped protect the settlement from flooding or erosion. The landscape around an oasis can be deceptive. Water gives life, but sudden flows, seasonal runoff, and unstable soils can threaten buildings. A heavy wall, built along a vulnerable edge, might have acted as a retaining structure or barrier against destructive movement of earth and water. Such an interpretation transforms the wall from a military device into environmental engineering. This possibility should not disappoint us. On the contrary, it deepens the story. To defend a settlement against nature requires observation, memory, and collective response. The people must have known where water moved after storms, where soil collapsed, where walls of houses wakened, where the ground needed reinforcement. They would have read the land not as passive scenery, but as a force with moods and dangers. A wall against flood is still a wall against chaos. Yet there is another layer, quieter, and perhaps more powerful. The wall may have been a symbol, not symbol in the weak sense of decoration, but in the ancient sense of a physical thing that makes an invisible idea real. Community is invisible until acted out. Belonging is invisible until marked. Shared obligation is invisible until people gather, labor, and build. When the people of Jericho raised stones around their settlement, they may have been making their collective identity visible. The wall could have said, without words, "We are the people of this place." Such a statement would have mattered in a world of movement. Other groups passed through the valley. Hunters followed animals. Kin networks stretched across landscapes. Marriage partners may have come from other communities. Trade or exchange may have brought unfamiliar objects and faces. In such a world, A boundary did not necessarily mean isolation, it meant definition. The people inside the wall were not cut off from the world, but they had become something recognizable within it. The wall also created a stage for labor. This may be one of its most overlooked functions. Large communal projects gather people into rhythm. Stone hauling, mortar preparation, surface leveling, repair work, and maintenance require coordination. Those who work side by side learn one another's strengths, tempers, loyalties, and limits. Labor can settle disputes or create them. It can reinforce leadership or expose weakness. It can turn neighbors into a body. Who commanded the work? That question haunts every stone. Perhaps there were elders whose authority came from age, memory, and persuasive speech. Perhaps certain households held greater status because they controlled access to resources or ritual knowledge. Perhaps labor was seasonal, organized through obligation rather than command. Perhaps no single leader stood above all, and the wall emerged from consensus, need, custom, and repeated cooperation. The absence of writing leaves us without titles. No king's name appears. No overseer signs the stones. The wall gives us action without explanation. Still, action is evidence. A wall of such scale tells us that the people of Jericho could imagine a collective future. They did not build only for the present day's hunger. They built against tomorrow's uncertainty. Whether danger came from strangers, flood, animals, erosion, or fear itself, the community answered through construction. They transformed anxiety into architecture. They made worry heavy enough to stand. Picture the settlement at dusk. The heat fades slowly from the stones. The wall catches the last light while shadows gather near its base. Beyond it, the open land darkens into uncertainty. The calls of birds sink into silence. Somewhere outside, an animal moves through dry grass. Inside, hearth smoke thickens, voices settle. Children are drawn inward. The wall may not have made the people completely safe, but it changed how night felt. It gave shape to trust. This psychological power should not be underestimated. Human beings need more than physical protection. They need signs that protection exists. A wall can reassure even when it cannot save. It can concentrate courage. It can turn scattered fear into shared vigilance. It can teach the young that the community has an edge, and that beyond that edge, the world must be approached with attention. And yet, walls also create new tensions. Once a boundary exists, someone must decide who crosses it. Guests, kin, traders, strangers, rivals, hunters returning late, families seeking shelter, all must pass through controlled spaces. The wall, therefore, may have encouraged rules of access. It may have created moments of negotiation. It may have sharpened the difference between insider and outsider. In this sense, the wall did not merely respond to society. It helped invent new social categories. There is a deep irony here. The first walls may have protected people from danger, but they also introduced a new kind of danger, the danger of division. To live within an enclosure is to feel secure, but also to become aware that the world is split. Those inside may be trusted more easily. Those outside may be imagined as threat, mystery, or opportunity. Civilization would carry this double inheritance for thousands of years. The wall as shelter and suspicion, identity and exclusion, pride and fear. At Jericho, the earliest wall stands near the beginning of that long inheritance. It is tempting to ask what the wall truly was, as if one final label would solve it. Defense, flood control, symbol, social project, boundary. But ancient life rarely fits inside one word. The people who built it may have understood it through stories, routines, obligations, and fears that no modern category can fully contain. A woman carrying food past it may have thought of safety. A child playing near it may have thought of shade. A worker repairing it may have thought of duty. An elder looking outward may have remembered a flood, a conflict, a ceremony, or a warning told by those already dead. Only the wall held all meanings together. This is why Jericho's early architecture remains so powerful. It forces us to see the first city not as a sudden invention of politics or warfare, but as a web of practical and symbolic acts. A wall can be built because water threatens. It can endure because fear persists. It can be repaired because identity depends on it. It can become sacred because generations grow old beneath its shadow. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The stones do not confess whether they first rose under urgency or ceremony. They do not tell us whether songs accompanied the work, whether disputes broke out, whether hands bled, whether children watched in awe as the settlement slowly enclosed itself. They do not tell us whether the builders felt they were making a fortress, a flood barrier, a sacred boundary, or simply doing what had to be done. What they do tell us is that the people of Jericho understood permanence as labor. They knew that a home could not merely be inhabited. It had to be defended, maintained, marked, and imagined. Their wall was not only an object in the landscape, it was a decision repeated in stone, a quiet declaration that the community had become worth protecting. And somewhere in that decision, the first city took another step out of the long, wandering dawn. Beneath the floors of ancient Jericho, the dead did not disappear. They remained inside the house. They lay close beneath the feet of the living, beneath the swept plaster, beneath the place where food was prepared, where children slept, where tools were kept, where morning light entered through low openings and smoke curled upward into the pale air. Death was not sent far away to a distant cemetery beyond the edge of settlement. Death was folded into domestic life. The ancestors stayed near. Among the most haunting discoveries from early Jericho are human skulls that had been carefully separated from the body and covered with plaster. Their faces were remade. Eyes were sometimes suggested with shells or other materials. Features were shaped by hand, not as exact portraits in the later artistic sense, but as acts of remembrance, transformation, and presence. These skulls are among the most intimate objects in the prehistoric world, not because they explain themselves clearly, but because they show that memory had become physical. A skull is already powerful. It is the architecture of a face after flesh has vanished. It holds the empty sockets where sight once lived, the jaw that once spoke, the curve of bone that once carried expression, hunger, laughter, and pain. To take such a thing and cover it with plaster is to refuse ordinary decay. It is to intervene. It is to say that the person is not finished simply because breath has left the body. The plastered skulls of Jericho open a dim chamber in the human mind. They reveal a community in which the dead were not only mourned, but curated. Someone chose the skull. Someone prepared the plaster. Someone shaped the features. Someone placed the object where it could be kept, seen, touched, hidden, displayed, or brought forth at meaningful moments. This required knowledge, time, and intention. It was not casual disposal. It was ritual labor. The question is why? Perhaps these skulls represented ancestors, honored members of households whose memory helped define the living group. In such a world, descent may have mattered deeply. A family's claim to a house, a floor, a storage place, a portion of water, or a relationship with other households could be strengthened by the presence of the dead. The ancestor was not an idea only. The ancestor had a face, restored in plaster, carried forward into the life of the community. Perhaps the skulls belonged to individuals of special importance, elders, ritual specialists, healers, founders, or people believed to possess power after death. The care given to them may reveal differences in status, not necessarily kingship or class as later societies would know it, but a ranking of memory. Some dead were treated in ways that others were not. Such differences may whisper of social value, obligation, and sacred authority. Or perhaps the skulls were not about rank at all. Perhaps they were about keeping grief manageable. To lose a parent, partner, sibling, or child is to experience absence as a wound in the world. The plastered skull may have made absence bearable by giving it form. It may have allowed the living to speak to the dead, remember them, consult them, or simply endure the strange fact that a familiar person had become something silent and enduring. Archaeology can describe the technique, but not the tears. The process itself must have been striking. After burial, the body decayed. At some later moment, the skull was retrieved. This required returning to the dead deliberately. After the first shock of loss had passed, the community did not merely bury and forget. It reopened memory. Hands entered the earth. Bone was lifted from darkness. The skull was cleaned and prepared. Plaster, smooth and pale, was pressed over the bone. Human fingers shaped cheeks, brow, nose, and mouth. The dead person acquired a second face. That second face was neither fully living nor fully dead. It occupied a threshold. Imagine a dim interior, cool compared with the sun outside. A plastered skull rests in a shadowed place, perhaps wrapped, perhaps set apart, perhaps brought forward for ceremonies no text records. A child looks at it with fear and familiarity. An elder speaks softly. The shell eyes catch a fragment of light. The face does not move, yet it seems to hold attention. It is not a corpse. It is not a statue. It is an ancestor made present through the materials of earth and memory. This practice belongs to a wider Neolithic world in the Levant, where the treatment of skulls and ancestors appears in several places. Jericho was not alone in its concern for the dead, but its examples remain among the most evocative. They show that the first settled communities were not built only around food production or defense. They were built around relationships that crossed the boundary between life and death. This is essential to understanding why people stayed. A settlement becomes powerful when it holds the dead. The living may leave a camp without leaving much behind. But when ancestors lie beneath house floors, departure becomes emotionally and spiritually heavier. The ground is no longer neutral. It has received the body. The house is no longer only a shelter. It is a vessel of lineage. Every repair to a floor may cover generations. Every step may pass above those who came before. The dead give depth to place. In Jericho, Domestic space may have been saturated with ancestral presence. This does not mean people lived in constant terror or solemnity. Ancient households also laughed, argued, cooked, flirted, worried, slept, and worked. Life continued with all its ordinary textures, yet beneath that ordinary life lay a sacred architecture. The living and dead were not divided by vast distance. They occupied the same moral field. The plastered skulls also remind us that the earliest towns needed stories strong enough to hold people together. Practical needs alone do not explain the emotional force of settlement. Grain can be stored anywhere dry enough. Water can be visited seasonally. Walls can be abandoned. But ancestors create attachment that is deeper than usefulness. They root identity in a place through memory, obligation, and reverence. Perhaps in the minds of Jericho's people when the ancestors watched over the living. Perhaps they protected the house. Perhaps they judged behavior within the family. Perhaps they guaranteed fertility of people, their animals, and plants. Perhaps they were called upon during sickness, disputes, births, deaths, and transitions into adulthood. Or perhaps their presence was quieter, less formal, and more intimate. A constant reminder that life flowed through generations like water through the spring. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the words spoken over these skulls. We do not know whether they were displayed openly or kept concealed. We do not know whether everyone could see them or only certain members of the household. We do not know whether they represented love, authority, fear, healing, inheritance, or some fusion of all these. The plastered faces look back at us from before writing, and their silence is almost unbearable. Yet even in silence, they change the story. They challenge the idea that early settled life was only an economic adaptation. The people of Jericho were not merely calculating calories beside a spring. They were shaping a cosmos. They were creating bonds between generations. They were remaking the human face after death so that memory could remain visible. They were building society not only with stone walls and mud brick houses, but with bones, plaster, ritual, and grief. This is where the first city becomes deeply human. For a city is not only a concentration of people, it is a concentration of memories. It is a place where births and deaths accumulate, where names are spoken until forgotten, where rooms hold echoes, where the past presses upon the living. Jericho shows this at an almost primordial level. Before streets and markets, before kings and inscriptions, the dead were already helping to make place sacred. Consider the emotional discipline required to retrieve a skull from a burial, to handle the remains of someone known or revered. To remake the face with plaster was not an act for a careless people. It required a concept of personhood extending beyond decay. It required a belief that bone could carry identity, or that ritual could restore it. It required hands steady enough to work with the dead and hearts strong enough to look upon what they had made. Those plastered faces are not primitive curiosities. They are philosophical objects. They ask what remains of a person after death. They ask whether memory can be housed in matter. They ask whether the living owe the dead continued care. They ask whether a community can exist without its ancestors. They ask us, across 11,000 years, whether we are so different when we keep photographs, preserve names, visit graves, speak to those who cannot answer, and carry the dead inside the rooms of the mind. At Jericho, the earliest citizens of permanence placed the dead beneath the floors and sometimes raised their faces again into the world of the living. It was an act tender and unsettling, familiar and strange. Through it, the house became a shrine, the family became a lineage, and the settlement became an archive of human presence. The skulls beneath the floors tell us that the first city was not built only upward, with towers and walls, but downward into the earth of memory. Its foundations were not only stone, they were ancestors. Climate is the unseen hand in many ancient stories. It does not speak with a human voice. It does not carve its name into stone. Yet it presses upon every choice, every harvest, every journey, every birth, every burial, every decision to stay or move. In the world of early Jericho, climate was not background. It was a power as real as hunger, as intimate as breath, and as unpredictable as the moods of the sky. To understand Jericho, we must enter the long environmental drama that surrounded its birth. The people who gathered near its spring lived during a time when the earth itself was changing. The bitter instability of the late Ice Age was giving way, slowly and unevenly, to the warmer conditions of the early Holocene. But this transition was not a smooth rising into comfort. It was marked by shocks, reversals, and regional stresses that tested human communities across the ancient Near East. Among the most important of these climatic events was the Younger Dryas, a cold and dry interval that disrupted environments across wide parts of the world. In the Levant, it likely altered rainfall patterns, plant communities, animal movement, and the availability of wild cereals. For people who depended on seasonal abundance, even small changes in rain or temperature could become matters of life and death. A hillside that once yielded generous stands of grain might thin, herds might shift their routes, springs and wetlands might become even more precious. The world would still offer food, but the rules of finding it could change. This is where the pressure begins. For countless generations, human groups survived through mobility and knowledge. When resources failed in one place, they could move to another. But as climate became less predictable, certain dependable locations would have gained extraordinary importance. A permanent spring in a dry valley was not merely useful, it was a refuge against uncertainty. Around such places, people may have gathered more often, stayed longer, and learned to manage resources with greater care. Environmental stress did not automatically create cities, but it could concentrate human attention. Jericho's oasis must be imagined within this larger pattern. While surrounding landscapes fluctuated between abundance and scarcity, the spring offered continuity. That continuity may have encouraged a shift from opportunistic return to deliberate residence. People who once followed the broad rhythm of the land may have begun to tie themselves more closely to zones where survival could be planned. In this sense, the first steps toward settled life may have been shaped not by simple prosperity, but by insecurity. This is one of the great paradoxes of civilization. Human beings often innovate not when life is easy, but when familiar strategies become strained. When the old pathways no longer guarantee safety, new arrangements become thinkable. Storage becomes more important. Social bonds become more necessary. Shared labor becomes a form of insurance. Ritual may intensify as communities seek meaning and control in a world that refuses to behave predictably. In the dry brightness of the Jordan Valley, the people of early Jericho would have watched the land with profound attention. They would have known the difference between a promising cloud and a passing haze. They would have felt the texture of soil underfoot and understood whether plants would return well. They would have noticed when animals arrived early, late, thin, or missing. Such knowledge was not scientific in the modern institutional sense, but it was empirical, patient, and exacting. Survival required observation across years, across generations. Climate leaves traces in pollen, sediment, plant remains, and landscape formation. It is reconstructed through careful analysis of ancient environments, through the study of lake cores, mineral deposits, charred seeds, and the shifting distribution of plant species. These methods allow researchers to approach the ancient atmosphere indirectly, like listening for thunder after the storm has vanished. The results do not give us one simple scene. They give us patterns of stress and adaptation, reminding us that Jericho rose during an age when the relationship between humans and the environment was being renegotiated. A warming world after the cold pulses of the late Ice Age would have opened new opportunities. But opportunity itself can be destabilizing. Plants changed, habitats shifted, populations grew in favorable zones. Human groups, encountering one another more frequently around reliable resources, may have needed new systems of cooperation. The same climate that made cultivation more attractive may also have made competition sharper. To live near a spring was to benefit from water, but also to accept that others knew of the same blessing. The early Holocene was not a golden paradise. It was a world of adjustment. Imagine the valley after a season of poor rain. The hills wear a thinner green. Dust rises more easily from the paths. The spring still flows, but the settlement feels the pressure of every mouth. Stored food becomes precious. Decisions grow heavier. Should the community eat what it has, save more, search farther, plant more carefully, send hunters deeper into the surrounding land. Welcome outsiders, refuse them, trade with them, marry them, fear them. Climate turns into social choice. Now imagine a season of abundance. Plants return thick along the margins. Animals gather. The settlement expands its confidence. Work parties move out with baskets and blades. Children eat better. Ceremonies may be larger. The people may feel that the world has approved their staying. Yet abundance, too, can bind people to place. It teaches them what is possible. It encourages them to build, repair, invest, and expect. Between scarcity and abundance, permanence grows. The people of Jericho did not control the climate, but they could respond to it. They could store food. They could refine harvesting tools. They could build stronger houses. They could organize labor. They could create rituals that gathered the community around shared hopes for fertility, protection, and continuity. They could watch the sky, the animals, the spring, and the fields of wild or cultivated plants with disciplined intensity. In this light, Jericho appears not as an escape from nature, but as a new way of living inside nature. The settlement did not stand outside the environment like a modern machine imposed upon land. It was woven into water, heat, season, soil, stone, plants, animals, disease, and human bodies. Its walls, houses, tools, and burials were responses to the environmental pressures surrounding them. The first city was not built against nature alone. It was built through negotiation with nature. The younger Dryas and the early Holocene remind us that civilization did not arise from pure human will. It was not simply an idea that someone invented. It was a dialogue between climate and culture. The sky tightened, the land shifted, the spring endured, and human communities adjusted. Somewhere in that tension, settlement became not only possible, but necessary, desirable, perhaps even sacred. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot know how the people explained changes in rain. We cannot know whether drought was blamed on offended ancestors, wandering spirits, broken obligations, or forces without names we would recognize. We cannot know whether a good season brought feasting, offerings, dancing, or quiet relief. Yet we can be sure that climate was felt not as an abstraction, but as sensation. Empty stomachs, cracked soil, heavy baskets, cool water on the hands, smoke from cooking fires when grain was plentiful, silence when it was not. Environmental stress also carries emotional weight. It shapes fear. It shapes memory. A community that survives a hard year does not forget it. Children hear stories of hunger. Elders remember the year when the herds failed, when the plants withered, when the spring saved them, when neighbors helped, when strangers came, when someone died, when someone shared. Such memories can become social rules. Store more, watch carefully, repair the walls, honor the dead. Do not waste water. Gather when the season turns. In this way, climate becomes culture. Jericho's rise may therefore reflect a profound human answer to uncertainty. Rather than scattering endlessly across a changing world, people gathered around a reliable place and made that place more reliable through labor, memory, and belief. They did not defeat the environment. They created a community strong enough to endure its moods. The first city was born beneath an unstable sky. That truth gives Jericho its dignity and its warning. For those early people were not passive victims of climate, nor masters standing above it. They were partners in a difficult bargain, adapting with intelligence, courage, and imagination. Their settlement reminds us that human history has always been shaped by the fragile conversation between what the earth permits and what people dare to attempt. And in the lower Jordan Valley, where heat shimmered over pale ground and water rose from hidden depths, humanity answered the pressure of climate with one of its oldest dreams. Stay, build. Remember, the people of ancient Jericho did not write their names upon clay, but they wrote themselves into matter. They wrote with stone blades, polished by use. They wrote with grinding slabs worn hollow by patient hands. They wrote with seeds blackened in hearths, with plaster smoothed across floors, with baskets vanished except for the marks they left behind, with bone tools, shell ornaments, and the quiet debris of daily survival. Their alphabet was not made of letters. It was made of objects. To enter their world, we must look downward, away from towers and walls, toward the small things that carried life from one sunrise to the next. Archaeology often becomes most powerful at this scale. Monumental structures astonish us, but ordinary tools bring us closest to human touch. A blade fits the hand. A grinding stone records pressure. A scraper remembers hide. A seed preserves the shadow of a meal. Through such things, vanished people become intimate. Lithic analysis, the study of worked stone tools, allows us to see skill where untrained eyes might see only fragments. The people of Jericho selected raw materials carefully. They knew which stone would fracture predictably, which could produce sharp cutting edges, which could be retouched after dulling, and which was worth carrying from farther away. Flint was not merely found, it was understood. Its internal structure, its color, its weight, its response to pressure, all mattered. A stone tool maker in Jericho was not a primitive improviser. He or she was a technician of the hand and eye. To strike a core and remove a useful blade required control, experience, rhythm, and anticipation. Too much force could ruin the piece. Too little force could fail to detach the flake. The angle mattered. The preparation mattered. The future use of the tool was imagined before the blow fell. In that moment, thought moved through stone. Some tools were used for hunting. Projectile points speak of a world still tied to animal movement and the open land beyond the settlement. Gazelle, wild cattle, birds, and other creatures formed part of the human economy and imagination. Hunting brought meat, hide, bone, sinew, and story. It required tracking, cooperation, courage, and knowledge of animal behavior. Even as settlement deepened, the people of Jericho remained connected to the wider landscape through pursuit and return. Other tools tell of plant harvesting, sickle elements, sometimes bearing the glossy sheen created by cutting grasses, reveal the repeated motion of gathering stems. That sheen is not decorative. It is use made visible. It forms when stone meets silica-rich plants again and again, when hands move through fields or wild stands, cutting, bundling, carrying. In that gloss lies the rhythm of harvest, the bend of bodies under sun, the rustle of dry stalks, the gathering of food that would later be processed inside the settlement. Grinding stones deepen the scene. Grain does not become food by wishing. It must be cracked, crushed, pounded, ground. The work is demanding. It bends the back, strains the wrists, covers the skin in fine dust, and consumes long hours. The stones used for grinding become worn by repetition, their surfaces hollowed and smoothed through the labor of countless meals. Every bowl of ground grain carried within it the sound of stone against stone, the effort of bodies, the patience of households. This daily labor is often hidden in grand histories, yet it may be one of the true foundations of settled life. The first towns were not sustained by walls alone. They were sustained by repeated acts of preparation, cooking, cleaning, carrying, repairing, and sharing. Much of this work may have fallen to women, though exact divisions of labor cannot be recovered with certainty. What matters is that survival depended on tasks that left subtle archaeological traces but shaped every waking day. Seeds recovered from ancient deposits offer another kind of testimony. Charred plant remains can survive where ordinary organic matter decays. Under the microscope, they reveal what people gathered, processed, cooked, stored, or accidentally burned. Wild cereals, legumes, and other plant foods help reconstruct diet and environment. They also reveal an important transition, not a sudden replacement of wild food by domesticated crops, but a gradual shift in human attention. Plants became watched more closely, selected more carefully, and woven more tightly into settlement life. The difference between gathering and cultivation may at first have been almost invisible. A group returns to a place where useful plants grow. They harvest. Some seeds fall near the settlement. People clear competing plants. They protect a patch. They return at the right season. They favor larger seeds, stronger stalks, easier harvesting. Over generations, the relationship changes. Human choice begins to shape plant life, and plant life begins to shape human society. This is one of the quietest revolutions in history. No one needed to understand genetics to alter the future of food. Selection could happen through habit, a hand choosing the fullest seed heads, a household saving certain grains, a community returning to favored stands. All could shift the relationship between people and plants. Long before fields became the ordered landscapes of later agriculture, there was attention. Attention was the first cultivation. Material culture also shows contact beyond immediate surroundings. Certain stones, shells, or other items may have traveled through exchange networks, gift relationships, kin ties, or seasonal movement. Jericho was not an isolated miracle sealed inside its walls. It belonged to a broader world of human interaction. People carried objects, techniques, stories, spouses, and ideas across distances. A tool style could move. A ritual practice could move. A shell from far away could arrive at the oasis and become an ornament, a marker of identity, or a memory of connection. Such exchange reveals that early settled people were not trapped by permanence. They were rooted, but not motionless. The settlement was a center from which movement continued. Hunters went out. Gatherers ranged across ecological zones. Visitors arrived. News traveled by mouth. Objects changed hands. The first city, in this sense, was not the end of mobility. It was a new kind of anchor within a still-moving world. The hands of Jericho were also hands of repair. Mud brick cracks, plaster flakes, baskets fray, blades dull, roofs leak, hearths need clearing, storage pits must be maintained. A settlement survives only through constant small acts of restoration. The archaeological record preserves floors laid over older floors, walls patched, spaces reused, materials recycled. This practical persistence may be less spectacular than initial construction, but it is the essence of permanence. To stay is to repair. Imagine a household at the close of day. Grain has been ground, a fire glows low, a blade is retouched by careful pressure. A child watches sparks rise. A worn basket sits near the wall, holding seeds or tools. The floor bears faint marks of use. Outside, the sounds of other households drift through the settlement. Voices, footsteps, the dull rhythm of work continuing even as the light fades. Nothing here is grand in the imperial sense, yet everything is foundational. The first city was made of such evenings. Bone tools may have pierced hides, shaped fibers, worked baskets, or assisted in fine tasks that stone could not perform as gently. Animal remains tell us not only what people ate, but how they butchered, shared, discarded, and perhaps valued different creatures. Cut marks on bones, burning patterns, species representation, and body part distribution allow archaeologists to reconstruct habits otherwise lost. Even refuse becomes eloquent when studied patiently. There is dignity in this debris. A broken tool is not failure alone. It is evidence of use. A burnt seed is not waste alone. It is a trace of food. A worn stone is not dullness alone. It is endurance. Ancient Jericho emerges most clearly when we resist the temptation to look only for drama and instead honored the repeated labor that made drama possible. Civilization is not born only in ceremonies. It is born in hands made rough by daily work. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know who made the finest blades, who taught the children to grind grain, who chose the best stone, who noticed that certain plants returned more strongly near disturbed soil. We do not know whether tool-makers held special respect, whether grinding songs accompanied labor, whether harvest was joyful, tense, sacred, or all at once. We do not know the taste of their meals, the smell of their cooking in full detail, or the comfort of eating after a hard day beneath the valley sun. But the materials allow us to approach. They show a people living with intelligence distributed across the whole community, not only in leaders or ritual specialists, but in every skilled act. The hunter reading animal tracks, the gatherer identifying ripe seeds, the knapper striking stone, the builder mixing plaster, the child learning by imitation, the elder remembering seasons of scarcity, all participated in a vast practical wisdom. Jericho was built by minds, but those minds worked through hands. And so, when we ask who built the first city, we must not imagine only powerful figures directing anonymous labor. We must imagine the ordinary multitude, the blade makers, the grain grinders, the water carriers, the plaster smoothers, the hunters returning at dusk, the children carrying small bundles, the elders watching the storage places, the dead beneath the floor, the living above them, repeating the gestures that made home possible. The earliest city was not a monument to one ruler. It was a monument to cumulative work. Its stones may catch our attention, but its tools reveal its soul. In every worn edge and every charred seed lies the truth that human history is not only the story of conquest, invention, and collapse. It is also the story of hands patiently transforming the world one task at a time. At Jericho, before writing remembered kings, before tablets counted tribute, before armies marched beneath standards, silent hands were already shaping the future. They cut, ground, carried, built, repaired, buried, and began again. Their work was small in the moment and immense across time. To understand the first city, we must ask not only what its people built, but how they lived together. A wall can be measured, a tower can be drawn, a floor can be traced in the earth. But society is more elusive. It hides in gestures, obligations, rules, favors, tensions, and shared expectations. It lives in who eats first, who speaks during disputes, who marries whom, who touches the dead, who stores grain, who decides when labor begins, who may enter certain spaces, and who must wait outside. These things rarely fossilize, yet they shape a community as surely as stone shapes a wall. Ancient Jericho forces us into this difficult territory. Here was a settlement large enough to require cooperation beyond a single household, yet old enough to stand before kingship, writing, taxation, formal law codes, and the administrative machines of later states. It belonged to an age when authority may have been present, but not yet hardened into the forms familiar from later civilizations. Its social shape was likely subtle, flexible, and deeply rooted in kinship, memory, ritual, and practical need. There may have been no king. That absence matters. The great cities of later Mesopotamia and Egypt would eventually produce rulers who stood above others, commanding labor, claiming divine favor, controlling surplus, and turning society into hierarchy. Jericho's earliest settlement, by contrast, gives us no royal tomb, no palace, no carved throne, no inscription declaring one man master of the walls. If power existed, it wore quieter clothing. Perhaps elders held influence. In a world without writing, memory is authority. Those who remembered past droughts, former disputes, good hunting grounds, dangerous strangers, marriages between families, and the stories of ancestors would have been deeply valuable. Age carried knowledge of seasons and consequences. An elder did not need a crown to shape decisions. A slow voice beside the hearth might have carried more force than any command. Perhaps ritual specialists held influence. The care of the dead, the shaping of plastered skulls, the timing of ceremonies, the interpretation of dreams, illness, fertility, and misfortune may have required people believed to possess special knowledge. Such individuals might have stood at the edge between ordinary life and unseen power. They may not have ruled in the political sense, yet their words could guide action. If ancestors were thought to affect the living, then those who knew how to speak to them, honor them, or calm them could become essential. Perhaps skilled workers gained status, a master stone toolmaker, a builder who understood foundations, a person who knew how to prepare fine plaster, a hunter of rare ability, or a healer familiar with plants could command respect. In small, settled communities, competence itself can become authority. People listen to those whose knowledge repeatedly saves labor, food, or life. But perhaps Jericho also retained strong elements of equality. Many hunter-gatherer societies are organized through sharing, persuasion, kin ties, and resistance to domination. When groups begin to settle, such values do not vanish overnight. The early people of Jericho may have carried forward traditions that discouraged arrogance and restrained would-be leaders. A person who boasted too loudly might be mocked. A household that hoarded too much might be pressured to share. A skilled speaker might persuade, but not command. Cooperation might have rested less on force than on reputation, obligation, and the fear of social shame. This is where the mystery becomes fascinating. A community can build large things without a king. It can gather labor through feast, ritual, danger, ancestry, mutual aid, and shared identity. People may work because their relatives work, because the season demands it, because the dead require it, because food will be safer, because refusal would mark them as selfish, because participation brings honor, or because the project itself becomes a ceremony. The absence of royal power does not mean absence of organization. It means organization may have been woven through the community rather than imposed from above. At Jericho, households were likely central. Each house was a unit of daily production, memory, and belonging. Food was prepared there, tools were kept there, children were raised there. The dead may have rested beneath it, yet no household could stand entirely alone. Water access, wall maintenance, large construction, marriage networks, hunting parties, ritual gatherings, and dispute settlement all required relationships across domestic boundaries. The first city was therefore a balancing act between household independence and communal necessity. This balance may have been delicate. Too much independence, and collective projects fail. Too much central control, and old traditions of autonomy fracture. The people of Jericho likely lived inside this tension, negotiating it not through written law, but through custom. A custom is a memory that has become instruction. It tells people how to behave because that is how things have been done, how ancestors did them, how harmony is kept, how danger is avoided. In an oral world, custom is not weak. It is the invisible wall inside the visible one. Food would have been at the center of social life. Who had enough? Who lacked? Who shared? Who stored? Surplus is never merely economic. It changes relationships. A household with abundant grain might gain influence. A person who controlled access to stored food during scarcity might become powerful. Yet shared feasting could also redistribute wealth and reinforce equality. Food can create hierarchy, but it can also repair community. Imagine a gathering after a successful harvest or hunt. Fires burn in the evening. Meat, grain, seeds, and gathered plants are prepared. The smell of smoke and cooked food spreads between houses. Children crowd near adults. Elders tell stories. A skilled hunter receives praise. A grieving family is offered portions. A young couple is noticed by both households. Tools are exchanged. Arguments soften or sharpen. The meal is not only eating, it is politics without a state. Ritual may have served a similar function. Ceremonies gather people into shared emotion. They make the group feel real. They remind households that they belong to something larger than themselves. The plastered skulls, burials, and perhaps communal structures at Jericho suggest that memory and sacred practice were not private matters alone. They may have tied different families into a shared understanding of origin, duty, and belonging. A community that honors ancestors together can become stronger than a cluster of neighbors. Yet we must be careful not to make Jericho too peaceful in our imagination. Close settlement creates friction. Noise, waste, jealousy, sexual tension, inheritance disputes, injured pride, failed obligations, hunger, sickness, and suspicion can all live within tight walls. The first city may have known gossip, resentment, rivalry, and fear as surely as cooperation. There may have been households with greater prestige and others with less. Some children may have eaten better than others. Some voices may have carried farther. Archaeology looks for signs of inequality in house size, burial treatment, access to goods, diet, health, and special objects. In early Jericho, the evidence does not present the clear, towering hierarchy of later kingdoms, but subtle differences may have existed. Human communities rarely remain perfectly equal when people begin to store goods, inherit houses, maintain ancestors, and invest labor into place. Permanence gives memory weight, and memory can become claim. This was my father's house. This was my mother's floor. These are our dead. This is our place. Such claims can strengthen belonging but also divide. The social shape of Jericho may therefore have been neither fully egalitarian nor sharply hierarchical. It may have occupied a middle ground, a community where older traditions of sharing met new pressures of storage, settlement, construction, and ancestry. Leadership may have emerged during certain tasks and faded afterward. One person might guide a ritual. Another might organize repairs. Another might lead a hunt. Another might mediate a quarrel. Power could have been situational rather than permanent. This kind of society is harder for us to imagine because later history has trained us to look for rulers. We ask who governed, who commanded, who owned, who conquered. Jericho asks us to think differently. It asks whether the first city may have been built before domination became its defining feature. It asks whether collective life began not with a throne, but with a circle of houses around water, with shared labor, with remembered dead, with anxious storage, with hands agreeing to raise stones together. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot hear a council debate. We cannot see who sat closest to the fire. We cannot know whether women held authority through food, birth, healing, ancestry, and household continuity. We cannot know whether men dominated hunting and construction, or whether tasks shifted according to age, skill, and circumstance. We cannot know the full lives of children, the disabled, the elderly, or those who stood outside ordinary categories. The mound preserves architecture more easily than affection, tools more easily than trust, but the evidence does allow one powerful conclusion. The people of Jericho achieved social coordination without the visible machinery of later states. That alone is extraordinary. They gathered enough labor to build, maintain, bury, store, repair, and endure. They created a community dense enough to require rules, yet ancient enough to remain close to the world of foragers. They lived at a threshold where humanity was inventing new ways to be together. In that threshold lies the true social drama of the first city. Jericho was not only a place where people settled, it was a place where relationships settled, kinship hardened into household, memory hardened into ancestry, cooperation hardened into custom, need hardened into obligation, fear hardened into boundary, work hardened into architecture. The city did not begin as streets and markets. It began as the social courage to remain close, season after season, despite all the dangers of closeness. To live together is one of humanity's greatest achievements and one of its oldest difficulties. Jericho shows both. Its people were not faceless builders of a prehistoric curiosity. They were neighbors, they were relatives, they were rivals, mourners, workers, lovers, children, elders, and the remembered dead. In their unseen arrangements, in their fragile agreements, in the quiet pressure of their shared life, the first city found its human form. Even the most ancient experiments in permanence were not permanent forever. Jericho, so often imagined as a single continuous miracle rising from the prehistoric earth, was in truth a living sequence of growth, disruption, renewal, and change. Its earliest settlement did not simply continue unchanged from one generation to another until history arrived to name it. Like every human place, it passed through moments of strain. Houses were abandoned, floors were buried, structures collapsed or were deliberately filled. New forms of life appeared above older ones, and the mound thickened with evidence of transition. The buried break in continuity is one of the most important lessons Jericho offers. It tells us that the first city was not a finished answer. It was an experiment under pressure. In archaeology, discontinuity can be subtle. It is not always a burned layer, a smashed gate, or a field of bodies. Sometimes it is a change in house form. Sometimes it is a different tool tradition. Sometimes it is a gap in occupation. Sometimes it is a new way of burying the dead, a new pattern of floors, a new choice of materials, a new relationship between people and space. The earth does not always shout when society changes. Often it murmurs. At Jericho, the earliest great phase of pre-pottery Neolithic settlement gave way to transformations that remain difficult to explain with certainty. There were shifts in architecture, ritual practice, population, and material culture. Some layers suggest abandonment or reduced occupation. Others reveal rebuilding by people whose habits were not identical to those who came before. The mound becomes less like a straight road and more like a braided river, dividing, returning, altering its course as time passes through it. Why would a community so well placed beside a spring falter? The answer may lie in the very success of settlement. Permanence creates accumulation, not only of memory and architecture, but of problems. Living close together changes the environment. Wood must be gathered for fuel and construction. Plants near the settlement may be overused. Animals may retreat from regular human pressure. Waste accumulates, insects, rodents, and disease find opportunity in dense habitation and stored food. The ground itself becomes crowded with houses, pits, burials, debris, repairs, and ruined walls. A settlement that endures must constantly manage the weight of its own past. The people of Jericho may have faced such burdens. The oasis was generous, but no place is limitless. A growing population would have required more food, more water management, more social cooperation, and more negotiation over rights and responsibilities. If climate fluctuated, if harvests failed, if conflict increased, if sickness spread, if rituals lost authority, if households divided, then the settlement could weaken from within without any invading army needing to appear. There may also have been movement by choice. The people of the early Neolithic were not prisoners of their walls. They had inherited long traditions of mobility, and even after settling, they remained connected to wider landscapes. If conditions became difficult, some families may have left for other settlements, seasonal camps, or kin communities elsewhere. Abandonment need not mean catastrophe. It may mean decision. It may mean adaptation. It may mean the recognition that staying, once wise, had become too costly. Yet when people leave a place like Jericho, they do not leave emptiness. They leave floors under dust. They leave hearths gone cold. They leave grinding stones too heavy to carry. They leave burials beneath houses. They leave the scent of old smoke trapped in earth. They leave walls that weather slowly under sun and winter rain. They leave a memory in the landscape that may draw others back. Picture a house after its last occupation. The roof weakens, the plaster floor cracks. Wind carries fine dust through an opening. A small tool lies forgotten near a wall. A hearth fills with soil. Insects enter. A season passes, then another. The walls slump inward. The room becomes less a place of life than a pocket of archaeology waiting for discovery. Yet beneath that ruin, the ancestor remains, and above it, another generation may one day build. This is how mounds are made, not through one death, but through many endings that become foundations. The transition between early phases at Jericho also reminds us that culture can change without the complete disappearance of people. A new architectural style does not automatically mean total replacement. A new burial custom does not necessarily mean strangers arrived and erased the old. Communities transform from within. Children reject some practices of their elders and preserve others. Households marry outsiders. Visitors settle. Ideas spread. Techniques are adopted because they work, because they impress, because they carry prestige, or because old ways no longer answer new conditions. Still, new people may indeed have come. The Levant was a corridor of movement, not a sealed chamber. Groups moved along valleys, across hills, toward water sources, through exchange networks and seasonal territories. Jericho's spring would have been known and remembered far beyond the settlement itself. When one community weakened, another may have taken interest. When houses decayed, new builders may have arrived with different customs, different kinship ties, different memories, and different dead. The buried break in continuity therefore asks us to hold several possibilities at once: abandonment, reoccupation, transformation, migration, adaptation, decline, renewal. These are not mutually exclusive. Human history often changes through mixtures, not single causes. A drought may weaken a settlement. Social tension may scatter families. Outsiders may enter. Survivors may return. Rituals may change. Tools may shift. The old site may become new without ever becoming entirely severed from what came before. The emotional world of such transition is nearly impossible to recover. Yet it deserves imagination. What did it feel like when a house line ended? When a floor was no longer repaired? When an ancestor place was covered and not reopened? When the sound of grinding stones became fewer in the morning? When children were told that the family might move? When strangers occupied spaces where others had once lived? Archaeology sees patterns. Human beings lived the uncertainty. A settlement's continuity is not merely a fact, it is a feeling. It depends on people believing that the community still has a future. When that belief weakens, walls become burdens. Stored food becomes insufficient. Rituals become hollow. And remembered places become heavy with grief. To abandon a home is rarely simple. It may be forced by hunger, disease, danger, or exhaustion. It may also be chosen with sorrow because survival demands movement. And then, after the leaving, silence. The spring may continue to flow. Birds may return to the reeds. Animals may cross the ruined edge of habitation. The tower may cast its shadow over fewer voices. Rain may strike exposed mud brick and carry it back toward the earth. What was once crowded with breath becomes a landscape of remnants. Yet such silence is never final in a place like Jericho. The water remains an invitation. The mound remains a landmark. The old settlement, even in ruin, marks a possibility others can recognize. When new occupation appears in the archaeological record, it does not erase the earlier city. It rests upon it. Later builders may not have known the full depth beneath their feet, but they lived over an ancient accumulation of human effort. Their floors covered older floors. Their customs replaced and mingled with older customs. Their lives became another layer in the mound's long body. The first experiment had changed, but its place endured. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot name the cause of every break. We cannot watch the moment when one form of Jericho ended and another began. We cannot know whether the final days of a phase were dramatic or quiet, whether people fled in fear or drifted away across years. The evidence resists simple storytelling because real transition is rarely simple. Yet this uncertainty is not emptiness. It is a warning against imagining ancient societies as still images. Jericho was dynamic. Its people adjusted, suffered, rebuilt, remembered, and changed. The first city was not a monument outside time. It was a fragile human organism, dependent on food, water, trust, labor, belief, health, and hope. When any of these weakened, the organism changed shape. The buried break in continuity therefore makes Jericho more human, not less magnificent. It shows that the first city was vulnerable from the beginning. Its greatness was not that it never faltered. Its greatness was that the idea of settled life survived disruption. The mound records not one perfect triumph, but a long struggle to make permanence possible in an uncertain world. Every layer of Jericho is a conversation between endurance and loss. A house falls, another rises, a custom fades, another appears, a community weakens, another gathers. The dead sink deeper, the living build higher, the mound grows, and within that growth lies one of the oldest truths of civilization. Human beings do not inherit stability. They make it, lose it, remake it, and leave behind the traces of their attempts for distant minds to find in the earth. Bones carry stories that words never reached. Long after a voice has vanished, long after the house has fallen inward, long after tools have scattered and fires have cooled, the human body may preserve a record of ancestry, movement, diet, stress, kinship, and change. In the deepest past, where no written name survives, the body becomes one of the last witnesses, not a complete witness, not an easy one, but a witness all the same. At Jericho, and across the wider ancient Levant, the question of who built the earliest settled communities has been transformed by the growing field of genomic data. This science, careful and difficult, seeks fragments of ancient deoxyribonucleic acid from human remains and compares them with other ancient and modern populations. It does not replace archaeology. It cannot tell us what songs were sung, what stories were believed, or what grief felt like under a roof of reeds and plaster, but it can illuminate ancestry, biological relationship, and the movement of people across landscapes. For a site as old and complex as Jericho, such evidence matters profoundly. For many years, scholars relied mainly on artifacts, architecture, burial customs, and environmental evidence to discuss population change. If tools changed, perhaps new people had arrived. If houses changed, perhaps a new culture had entered. If burial practices shifted, perhaps belief had been transformed by outsiders. But these interpretations were always uncertain. Objects move in many ways. A tool style can spread without migration. A ritual can be borrowed. A house form can be copied. People can change their habits while remaining in place. Genomic data adds another line of inquiry. It asks whether the bodies themselves reveal continuity, mixture, or replacement. The ancient Near East was never a sealed world. The Levant lay between Africa, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. It was a corridor, a meeting ground, a passage of climates, animals, plants, stones, ideas, and people. Long before caravans and empires, human groups moved through its valleys and hills, following water, kinship, marriage, trade, and survival. Jericho, nourished by its spring, would have been part of this connected world. It may have drawn people from different surrounding zones, not as a sudden invasion, but as a slow gathering of lives. Ancestry in such a place was likely layered. Some families may have had deep local roots, connected to foraging groups that knew the Jordan Valley across many generations. Others may have carried ancestry from neighboring regions through marriage and movement. Children born in the settlement may have embodied multiple histories within their bodies. The first city was not necessarily the work of one isolated tribe, It may have been made by a community whose biological and cultural roots were already mixed, braided by the geography of the land. This matters because we often ask, who built Jericho, as if the answer must be a single people with a single origin. But the deeper answer may be more subtle. Jericho was likely built by people becoming a people. Communities are not always born from purity. More often, they are made through gathering, alliance, marriage, adoption, shared labor, shared danger, and shared memory. A person might arrive from beyond the hills, marry into a household, learn the customs of the spring, help repair the walls, bury a parent beneath a new floor, and become part of Jericho. A child might grow up hearing stories from two different lineages. An elder might remember a place now distant, while grandchildren considered the oasis their only true home. In this way, ancestry becomes settlement, and settlement becomes identity. Material culture supports this sense of connection. Objects and techniques found across the wider region reveal that early communities were in communication, whether through direct movement, exchange networks, or shared traditions. Stone tool forms, symbolic practices, construction habits, and burial customs do not appear as isolated inventions locked inside one mound. They belong to broader patterns of experimentation unfolding across the Levant. Jericho was exceptional in scale and preservation, but it was not alone in the human awakening toward permanence. The people who lived there were part of a great regional transformation. Across Western Asia, communities were beginning to settle, cultivate, store, build, and ritualize place in new ways. Some focused on communal structures, some on elaborate burial customs, some on early plant management, some on animal relationships that would, over time, lead toward domestication. The process was not uniform. It was not one idea spreading like a command. It was a vast mosaic of experiments, each shaped by local landscapes and inherited traditions. Jericho was one bright stone in that mosaic, set beside water in the lower valley. Genomic evidence from the wider region also reminds us that later populations did not simply appear from nowhere. The deep ancestry of early Neolithic peoples contributed to the long human fabric of the Near East and beyond. Over thousands of years, descendants of early farming and settled groups would move, mix, expand, and transform the genetic landscapes of surrounding regions. But we must be careful. The people of Jericho did not live in order to become someone else's ancestor in a modern chart. They lived for their own world, their own hunger, their own dead, their own children. Science can trace lines of descent, but dignity requires that we see them as complete people. Ancient deoxyribonucleic acid is fragile. Heat, moisture, soil conditions, and time destroy it. In warm regions, preservation can be difficult. Not every body yields data. Not every site can speak equally through genetics. The results that do emerge must be interpreted with caution, compared with archaeology, and protected from simplistic stories of race, identity, or ownership. Ancient ancestry is not a modern flag. It is a record of movement and mixture far older than our present categories. The people of Jericho would not have recognized the labels later scholars use. They did not call themselves Neolithic. They did not define their world through modern maps. Their sense of belonging may have rested in kin, house, spring, ancestor, season, and obligation. Genomic data can show connections among populations, but it cannot reveal the names by which people knew themselves. It cannot tell us whether a person felt local or foreign, honored or marginal, beloved or feared. Still, the body speaks in other ways. Skeletal remains can reveal patterns of diet through chemical analysis. They can show stress in childhood, disease, trauma, dental wear, physical labor, and sometimes repeated movements written into bone, grinding grain, carrying loads, walking terrain, kneeling, lifting, hunting, and building can all leave subtle marks. The first townspeople were not abstract representatives of a cultural phase. They were bodies under pressure. They had sore joints, worn teeth, healed injuries, infections, hunger seasons, childbirth dangers, and the fatigue of work. The rise of settled life changed the body. A diet more dependent on processed plant foods could affect teeth and health. Close living could increase exposure to disease. Repetitive labor could shape muscles and bones. Storage could reduce some risks of seasonal hunger while creating new risks of crowding, contamination, and social inequality. The first city may have offered security, but it also brought new burdens into flesh. Civilization began not only in architecture, but in skeletons bearing the cost of permanence. Imagine a woman whose teeth have been worn by years of eating grain ground with tiny particles of stone dust. Imagine a man whose shoulder remembers the repeated throwing of hunting weapons or carrying heavy loads. Imagine a child whose bones record a season of illness survived. Imagine an elder whose spine aches as the settlement wakes. These bodies built Jericho as surely as hands placed stone. Their biological lives are part of the city's foundation. Genomic data also raises the question of kinship within burial spaces. Were people buried beneath houses biologically related to those who lived above them? Did households preserve ancestry through actual descent, or could ancestors also be social, adopted, ritual, or symbolic? The distinction is important. Human beings often define family through more than blood. A revered skull might belong to a biological parent, but it might also belong to a founder, a ritual figure, a person claimed by the household through memory rather than descent. Ancient deoxyribonucleic acid may someday clarify some of these relationships, yet it may also reveal complexities that resist simple categories. The first city may have woven blood kinship with chosen belonging. Newcomers could become kin through marriage. Children could be raised by relatives beyond their birth parents. Ritual ancestors could unite households, not biologically close. Shared labor could create bonds stronger than descent. The social body of Jericho may, therefore, have been more flexible than any genetic chart alone can show. It was made from bodies, yes, but also from promises. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The genetic fragments that survive are faint sparks in a vast darkness. They illuminate patterns, not full lives. We cannot yet follow every family through the layers of the mound. We cannot identify the builder of the tower, the child who feared a plastered skull, the elder who remembered a distant homeland, the healer who gathered plants near the spring. Their bloodlines may echo in distant populations, but their individual selves remain beyond recovery. And yet, the science is profoundly moving. To study ancient ancestry is to realize that the people of Jericho were not a vanished other. They were part of the same long human river that carried all later communities into being. Their bodies belong to the deep history of movement, adaptation, mixture, and survival. The first city was not built by beings separate from us, but by humans fully alive in a world younger and harsher than ours, facing choices that still feel strangely familiar. Who belongs here? Who may enter? Whom do we marry? Whom do we remember? Whose dead are ours? What do we pass to our children? How do strangers become neighbors? How does a gathering become a people? These questions are older than writing. They were present in the blood, bones, houses, and burials of Jericho. New peoples, new genomes, new customs, and old memories all moved through the ancient Levant. The city beside the spring was not a fixed object, but a living convergence. Its builders carried ancestral paths within them and created a place where those paths could meet. They were local and connected, rooted and mobile, ancient and new. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Perhaps more ancient deoxyribonucleic acid will be recovered. Perhaps refined methods will reveal household relationships in clearer detail. Perhaps chemical analysis will map childhood movement, showing who grew up at the spring and who arrived from elsewhere. For now, the evidence leaves us with a vision both scientific and poetic. Jericho was built not by a single bloodline alone, but by human continuity itself, by bodies shaped by migration, memory, labor, hunger, kinship, and hope. Its first citizens came from the long road behind them, and in settling, they opened another road, one that would lead toward every village, town, and city that followed. Long after the first builders of Jericho had vanished into the earth, long after their houses had crumbled and their plastered dead had fallen silent, the place itself refused to disappear from human memory. This is one of Jericho's strangest powers. It began in the deep prehistoric darkness, before writing, before kings, before the familiar architecture of civilization, yet it later entered the bright and turbulent world of story. Across thousands of years, Jericho became more than a settlement. It became a symbol. It was remembered as ancient even by people who themselves lived in ancient times. Its name came to carry the weight of walls, conquest, sacred promise, destruction, and return. The mound became not only an archaeological site, but a meeting place between the measurable past and the remembered past. To separate these layers is delicate work. The Jericho of the earliest settled community belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic world, a time so remote that no written tradition from its own people survives. The later Jericho of famous narrative belongs to a very different age, after farming had spread widely, after pottery had become common, after towns and cities had risen and fallen across the Near East, after bronze had transformed warfare, craft, and exchange, after written cultures had begun preserving royal names, laws, prayers, and legends. Between these worlds lay thousands of years. That distance matters. When later peoples told stories of Jericho, they were not remembering the tower builders of 9,000 years before the Common Era in any direct historical sense. The first citizens had no surviving written record to hand down their own account. Their memory, if it endured at all, became absorbed into the landscape, into the mound, into the sense that this place was old beyond ordinary reckoning. Later generations stood upon earlier layers without fully knowing them. Their stories rose above buried lives. Yet archaeology and legend are not enemies. They are different forms of human approach to the past. Archaeology asks what can be shown through evidence, through stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, architecture, tools, bones, seeds, and soil. Legend asks what a place meant to those who inherited it, feared it, claimed it, or explained it through sacred narrative. One gives us material sequence, the other gives us memory shaped by meaning. To confuse them is dangerous. To listen to both carefully is powerful. Jericho's later fame often centers on walls. This is fitting, but also misleading. The walls of story belong to later cultural imagination and later historical periods, not simply to the earliest Neolithic enclosure. Yet the symbolic force of walls may have deep roots. A walled place invites interpretation. It creates drama. It stands as a challenge. To those outside, a wall can represent arrogance, protection, fear, power, or separation. To those inside, it can represent safety, identity, and divine favor. A wall is never only architecture once people begin telling stories about it. Over time, Jericho became a stage upon which later communities explored questions of obedience, destiny, judgment, and possession of land. Its walls became more than stone. They became moral objects. They could stand, fall, accuse, or testify. Whether later traditions preserve echoes of real Bronze Age events, reshape older memories, or speak primarily in theological language, they show that Jericho had become a place where history and sacred imagination were inseparable. The mound itself encouraged this. A mound is visible time. It rises from the plain as if the past has taken physical form. To those without excavation, it can seem mysterious, haunted, significant. People living near such a place may find pottery fragments after rain, stones from forgotten walls, bones disturbed by erosion, strange shapes in the soil. They may not know the full sequence beneath their feet, but they know the place has depth. Depth invites story. Imagine a later traveler approaching Jericho after the earliest city had long disappeared. The spring still flows. Palms and cultivated land mark the oasis. Ruins or traces of occupation stand nearby, depending on the period. The mound rises, layered but unread. The traveler hears that this place is old, that great events happened here, that walls once stood, that powers beyond ordinary human strength shaped its fate. Whether the story is history, warning, or sacred teaching, the place itself seems to support it. The land becomes a witness. This is how memory gathers around ancient sites. The first people of Jericho did not build for later scriptures. They did not imagine themselves as characters in stories told thousands of years after their deaths. They built for water, food, ancestors, safety, and meaning within their own world. Yet their decision to remain made Jericho unusually durable as a place of human return. Because people kept coming back to the oasis, because later settlements rose in the same landscape, because the name and location retained significance. The earliest prehistoric act of settlement helped create the conditions for later memory. The city became a palimpsest, a surface written on again and again. Each generation added meaning. Neolithic households made the place domestic and ancestral. Later communities made it agricultural, urban, strategic, sacred, contested. Bronze Age inhabitants lived in a world of trade, fortification, and regional power. Iron Age storytellers and scribes placed the city inside grand narratives of identity and divine action. Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, and modern periods added further layers of occupation, reverence, scholarship, and conflict. Jericho did not have one life. It had many lives, stacked like its archaeological deposits. To study such a place requires restraint. One must not drag the earliest settlement into later stories, as if time had no depth. Nor should one dismiss later memory as meaningless simply because it is not the same thing as prehistoric evidence. The Neolithic city and the remembered city belong to different registers, yet both show humanity's need to anchor identity in place. The first through houses, burials, and walls, the later through narrative, worship, and inheritance. This tension makes Jericho one of the great teaching sites of world history. It reminds us that the past is not one thing. There is the past that happened, the past that was remembered, the past that was forgotten, the past that was excavated, and the past that is imagined. At Jericho, these pasts do not lie neatly apart. They press upon one another. A spade cuts through legendary expectation and finds prehistoric astonishment. A sacred story draws people to a place where science reveals something even older than the story itself. The result is not confusion if handled carefully, it is depth. The oldest Jericho asks us to think beyond written tradition. It tells us that humanity's capacity for settlement, ritual, architecture, and collective identity began before named heroes and recorded wars. The later memory of Jericho asks us to consider how places become vessels of meaning far beyond their original purpose. Together, they show that human beings do not merely inhabit landscapes, they narrate them. A city can outlive its builders in two ways. It can survive materially, in stones, foundations, and buried debris. It can also survive imaginatively, in stories repeated by firesides, in chants, in scrolls, in sermons, in scholarship, in the minds of children who picture walls under a blazing sky. Jericho survived in both ways. Its archaeology reaches downward into the Stone Age. Its memory rises upward through religion, literature, and global imagination. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know when Jericho first became a place of legend. We do not know how many local tales disappeared before the written traditions that later became famous. We do not know whether shepherds once told stories of the ancient tower, or whether its memory vanished completely beneath later occupations. We do not know how prehistoric ancestral rites may have echoed, if at all, in later sacred geography. Time does not preserve every bridge, but the absence of certainty does not empty the place of wonder. It enlarges it. There is something profound in knowing that beneath a city of later memory lay a settlement older than the memory itself. Beneath the walls of story were walls of another world. Beneath the famous name were nameless people. Beneath the drama of conquest and sacred history were households grinding grain, tending fires, shaping plaster, burying their dead, and listening to water in the darkness. This is the true grandeur of Jericho. It belongs to humanity before and after writing. It stands at the meeting point of evidence and imagination, science and story, earth and word. It asks us to honor the distinction between them without tearing them apart. For human beings need both. We need the disciplined patience of excavation, and we need the deep symbolic language through which places become meaningful. In the end, Jericho's later memory does not replace its prehistoric reality. It rests above it, like one layer of the mound above another. The ancient city beside the spring became a sacred and historical symbol because people kept returning to it, naming it, fearing it, explaining it, and wondering at it. The first builders could not know this future. Yet, through their decision to stay, they began the long accumulation that made such memory possible. From sacred village to legendary city, Jericho traveled an immense road through time. Its stones became evidence. Its name became story. Its mound became a bridge between the human need to know and the human need to believe. And there, in that bridge, the city still lives. No city begins with the promise that it will last forever. Even the first places of settlement, even those raised beside generous water and protected by human labor, were fragile arrangements. They depended on trust, food, health, climate, memory, and the willingness of people to keep repairing what time steadily undid. Jericho's earliest life was astonishing, but astonishment is not immunity. The first city was also the first proof that settled life carried within it new burdens. To ask why the first city faded is to ask what permanence costs. A camp can be lifted, a route can be changed, a band can move away from sickness, exhausted plants, social conflict, or a landscape that has failed for a season. But a settlement gathers weight. Houses anchor people. Stored food attracts pests and danger. Burials bind families to floors. Walls require maintenance. Water access must be shared. Disputes echo because neighbors cannot simply vanish into the hills without consequence. The more a community invests in place, the harder it becomes to leave, and the more painful it becomes when staying grows dangerous. Jericho's earliest settlement may have faced environmental pressure in many forms. The oasis was life-giving, but the surrounding world was not limitless. Fuel had to be gathered. Wood and brush disappeared more quickly when many hearths burned in one place. Useful plants near the settlement could be over-harvested. Animals might avoid zones of repeated human activity. If cultivation increased, soil fatigue, changing rainfall, and pests could weaken harvests. What had once seemed a perfect refuge could slowly become a demanding landscape requiring constant management. There is a quiet danger in success. A thriving settlement encourages population growth. More children survive. More families need houses. More grain must be processed. More water is drawn. More waste accumulates. More relationships must be negotiated. What begins as abundance can become crowding. What begins as cooperation can become friction. What begins as shelter can become confinement. Disease may have been one of the invisible enemies of early settled life. When people live closely together, when waste builds up, when food is stored, when rodents and insects find reliable places to feed, the conditions for sickness change. The first towns created opportunities not only for human society, but for parasites and pathogens. The same walls that gathered families into security may also have gathered infection into intimacy. Illness in a mobile group can be devastating, but dense settlement gives disease a different kind of pathway. The bodies of the first townspeople may have carried these costs. Repetitive labor, dietary change, crowded living, and exposure to new disease environments could all leave traces. Worn teeth from ground grains, stress markers from childhood hardship, injuries from work, and signs of infection remind us that the road toward civilization was not a smooth ascent into comfort. It was a bargain made with pain. The city protected people from some dangers while creating others, Social strain may have been just as serious. In a small mobile group, sharing is often enforced by need, kinship, custom, and the knowledge that survival depends on cooperation. In a larger, settled community, storage and inheritance can complicate those relationships. Some households may accumulate more food, tools, prestige, or ancestral claim than others. The house itself becomes a possession. The dead beneath the floor become proof of belonging. A family can say, "This is ours," not only because we live here, but because our ancestors lie here. Such claims can hold a community together, yet they can also divide it. If one household has more stored grain during scarcity, should it share freely? If one lineage claims special closeness to revered ancestors, should others accept its authority? If certain people organize labor, do they become servants of the group or masters over it? If disputes arise over water, marriage, inheritance, or ritual rites, who decides? Jericho may not have had kings, but it did not need kings to know tension. The first city may have faded because the social tools available to its people were not always strong enough for the new world they were creating. This is not failure in any simple sense. It is experimentation. Humanity was learning how to live in numbers, how to store food without destroying trust, how to honor the dead without freezing society into rival claims, how to cooperate without being consumed by authority, how to remain rooted without becoming trapped. These questions did not vanish after Jericho. They would follow every city that came after. From river kingdoms to modern capitals, another pressure may have come from the spiritual weight of place. Ancestors beneath floors can sanctify a house, but they can also make it heavy. Rituals can bind communities, but they can also demand continuity when practical life requires change. A settlement filled with the dead is not easily reorganized. One cannot move a wall, rebuild a room, or abandon a household space without entering a world of memory and obligation. The sacred can preserve, but it can also constrain. Perhaps some families felt the old rituals no longer answered new fears. Perhaps younger generations saw the settlement differently from their elders. Perhaps newcomers brought different practices. Perhaps the authority of certain ancestors weakened as lineages died out, merged, or moved away. The fading of a city may not always begin with hunger. It may begin when people stop believing that the old forms can hold them. Violence remains a possibility, though not always the easiest answer. Settled communities possess valuable things: stored food, crafted tools, water access, and built shelter could attract raiding or conflict. A wall may reduce danger, but it cannot remove envy, fear, or competition. Conflict could weaken population, disrupt food gathering, damage trust, or make the settlement feel unsafe. Yet destruction by enemies is only one form of collapse, and perhaps not the most important. More often, cities fade through many pressures layered together until ordinary repair no longer keeps pace with damage. That phrase, ordinary repair, may be the key. A city survives because people repair it daily. They mend roofs, smooth floors, clear waste, settle quarrels, teach children, tend food, remember obligations, maintain walls, and renew belief. Collapse begins when repair fails. Not only physical repair, but social and spiritual repair. When fewer hands answer the call, when trust thins, when hunger sharpens suspicion, when sickness weakens households, when ceremonies no longer gather everyone, when the wall cracks and remains cracked, when a house is not replastered, when a storage pit is left empty, when a path grows quiet. Picture the settlement during a period of fading. The spring still runs, indifferent and generous, but some houses stand unoccupied. A roof has collapsed and no one has rebuilt it. The plaster of a floor is broken. A grinding stone lies where it was last used, too heavy or too common to carry away. Smoke rises from fewer hearths. Voices still sound, but the density of life has changed. Children play near spaces where children once slept. An elder looks toward a wall that no longer feels like certainty. No single moment announces the end. This is what makes early transition so difficult to interpret. Later generations may imagine collapse as fire, screaming, and finality. Archaeology often reveals something slower: the drift of households, the weakening of maintenance, the alteration of customs, the arrival of other practices, the partial abandonment of one area and use of another. The settlement does not die like a person. It changes state, moving from full life into memory, from memory into ruin, from ruin into layer. Environmental change could have accelerated this process. A series of dry years, altered plant availability, reduced hunting success, or pressure on local resources might have made the settlement less viable. If people had kin elsewhere, departure could become the sensible choice. Some may have returned to greater mobility. Some may have joined other communities. Some may have remained until the place felt smaller, older, and burdened by its own past. Migration in such a world was not necessarily defeat. It was knowledge in motion. The descendants or relatives of Jericho's people may have carried practices outward, adapting them elsewhere. Techniques of building, harvesting, storing, burying, and remembering could survive even when a particular settlement declined. A city may fade while its ideas travel. In that sense, Jericho's transformation did not erase its achievement. It scattered its lessons into the wider human world. The first city faded because no place, however ancient, can escape change. But its fading also reveals something profound about the nature of civilization. Civilization is not a possession once acquired. It is a relationship that must be renewed, between humans and land, between household and community, between living and dead, between hunger and storage, between freedom and belonging, between fear and trust. When those relationships strain too far, the city weakens. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know whether the people of early Jericho spoke of decline. We do not know whether they feared abandonment, welcomed change, or understood their world as simply continuing in altered form. We do not know whether the last families felt lonely among old stones, or whether the transition was so gradual that no one living through it thought of an ending at all. But the mound remembers what people could not. It remembers that permanence was never effortless. It remembers that settlement demanded coordination beyond instinct. It remembers that the first city carried all the seeds of later urban triumphs and all the seeds of later urban troubles: crowding, inequality, disease, resource pressure, boundary, belonging, memory, identity, repair, exhaustion. Jericho should not be imagined as a failed experiment because it changed. It should be understood as a brave and costly experiment because it existed at all. Its fading does not diminish its importance. It completes the truth of it. The first city was not made of stone alone. It was made of balance, and balance is always temporary. In the end, the earliest Jericho faded because every human community lives inside limits. Water may gather people, labor may protect them, ritual may bind them, memory may root them, but climate shifts, bodies weaken, resources thin, children grow restless, strangers arrive, customs change, and the dead become too many for the living to carry in the same way. The city faded, but the idea endured. Somewhere beyond the broken floors and quiet hearths, humanity had learned something irreversible. People had learned that they could gather in one place and make a world together. They had learned that stone could hold fear, that houses could hold memory, that food could hold the future, that ancestors could hold identity, and that community could become architecture. That knowledge did not vanish when one settlement weakened. It traveled onward through hands, bodies, marriages, stories, and experiments in other valleys. Jericho's earliest form passed into the earth, but the human longing it expressed did not die. The first city faded because it was human, and because it was human, it left behind not merely ruins, but a question every later city would inherit. How long can we remain together? And what must we become in order to stay? The stones of Jericho do not speak loudly. They do not rise in polished columns. They do not glitter with gold. They do not preserve the face of a ruler staring across eternity. They are older than such ambitions, older than the age when human beings learned to announce themselves through monuments of conquest and carved proclamations. Jericho's earliest remains are quieter, rougher, and more profound. They belong to the first deep attempt to make home endure. This is why Jericho casts such a long shadow. It stands at the beginning of a question that has followed humanity ever since. What does it mean to live together in one place? Beneath that question lie others, just as ancient and just as unsettled. How do we share water? How do we divide food? How do we remember the dead? How do we welcome strangers? How do we protect children? How do we build without destroying the ground that sustains us? How do we remain free while bound to others? How do we create belonging without turning the outside world into an enemy? The first city was not merely an answer to hunger. It was an answer to loneliness, fear, memory, and hope. It gathered people into a shared experiment, forcing them to confront the promise and peril of closeness. Around the spring, human beings began to understand that life could become layered. A house could stand where another had stood. A child could grow above the bones of an ancestor. A wall could be repaired by hands that had not built it. A tower could outlive every person who carried its stones. A place could become more than useful. It could become meaningful. In that meaning, Jericho still belongs to us. Modern cities are vast beyond anything its first builders could have imagined. They blaze with light through the night. They pulse with engines, markets, towers of glass, hidden pipes, crowded roads, messages moving invisibly through the air. Millions live within landscapes made almost entirely by human intention. Yet the old questions remain: water, food, disease, inequality, memory, boundary, fear, cooperation, and the dead beneath our histories. The scale has changed, but the human condition has not escaped its oldest foundations. Jericho reminds us that civilization did not begin as certainty. It began as risk. There was no guarantee that settled life would succeed, no guarantee that people could endure the tensions of proximity, no guarantee that storage would save more than it divided, no guarantee that walls would protect more than they separated, no guarantee that ancestors would bind households rather than burden them. Yet the people of Jericho tried. They stayed beside the spring. They built. They buried. They repaired. They watched the seasons. They carried stone. They shaped plaster. They turned a place in the valley into a human world. To call them primitive is to misunderstand them completely. They were our intellectual equals, living with different tools under different skies. Their knowledge was not written in books, but in hands, memory, and observation. They knew stone by fracture, plants by season, animals by track, water by sound, weather by scent, kinship by obligation, and death by touch. They did not need kings to organize labor, nor writing to remember, nor metal to transform the land. Their achievement was not smaller because it was early. In some ways, it was greater because there were so few models to follow. The first builders of Jericho stepped into uncertainty without a map of civilization behind them. They did not know they were early. They did not know that distant ages would measure them through radiocarbon dating, stratigraphic excavation, lithic analysis, botanical study, skeletal research, and genomic data. They did not know that scholars would argue over their walls, wonder at their tower, and stare into the plastered faces of their dead. They lived inside the present of their own world, as all people do. Their days were filled not with destiny, but with tasks. Carry water, grind grain, watch a child, repair a floor, hunt beyond the settlement, prepare a burial, listen to the night. History is made of such ordinary hours. The grandeur of Jericho lies partly in this humility. It does not show us civilization appearing fully formed, robed in splendor. It shows us civilization as a fragile habit, repetition becoming institution, labor becoming architecture, memory becoming sacred space, need becoming cooperation, fear becoming boundary, hope becoming settlement. It shows us that the road to cities was not a clean march upward, but a difficult wandering through experiment, compromise, and loss. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the first word spoken for the spring. We do not know the sound of a mother calling a child through a doorway. We do not know whether the tower inspired awe, fear, duty, or comfort. We do not know the private thoughts of the person who shaped plaster over a skull and gave the dead a second face. We do not know the names of those who decided to stay when movement was still possible. We do not know who first looked at the settlement and felt that it was home. The unknown is not emptiness. It is the dark chamber in which wonder survives. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. New methods may yet recover finer traces from bone, soil, plant remains, and stone. New excavations may alter old interpretations. New questions may reveal patterns that earlier eyes could not see. The mound has not finished teaching. Ancient places rarely surrender all at once. They give slowly, and only to those patient enough to listen. Yet even now, Jericho has already given us something immense. It has shown that the first city on earth was not born from arrogance, but from vulnerability. People gathered because life was uncertain. They built because tomorrow mattered. They remembered because the dead still belonged. They stayed because water, kin, fear, ritual, and hope drew them into a shared destiny. Their city should perhaps not have existed so early, according to old and simple stories of progress, but it did. And because it did, the human future changed. Every later city carries a fragment of Jericho's question. The river capitals, the desert citadels, the mountain towns, the ports, the sacred centers, the modern megacities lit under restless skies, all belong to the same long road. Each asks whether humans can live together without forgetting the sources of life beneath them. Each asks whether walls can protect without imprisoning. Each asks whether memory can guide without chaining the living to the past. Jericho does not answer for us. It offers a beginning, and perhaps that is enough. Beneath the mound, in the layered silence of floors and stones, lies the evidence of a people who dared to make permanence in a world that had never promised it. They were not the end of wandering, but the beginning of another kind of journey, the journey inward into community, obligation, memory, and the difficult dream of home. So let the night settle gently around this ancient oasis. Let the spring continue to murmur in the imagination. Let the walls stand uncertain, the tower rise in shadow, the skulls keep their silent faces, and the nameless builders return to the dignity they deserve. They are not lost entirely. Every city remembers them without knowing it. At Jericho, humanity first began to gather its scattered footsteps into stone. End of script. Good night.